hey, I didn't see you there.
We begin with the mass shooting at a July 4th parade in a Chicago suburb.
I am breaking through no matter what.
A person of interest is in custody after an hours-long manhunt.
You're always on my mind.
He lived here with his mother up until the shooting, when it was abruptly abandoned.
This is Robert Crimo, also known as Awake the Rapper. On the surface, he was a small-time artist from Illinois. He held a quiet presence in person and had a small following online. But between the years of 2019 and 2022, behind the screen, something within him was slowly starting to unravel. Now, if you look close enough, his videos were already unsettling, and his lyrics, well, they were laced with subtle cues of violence. So, in theory, the red flags and warning signs were already kind of there. But over time, his online world would grow darker, more chaotic, and even more disturbing. And on July the 4th of 2022, that being Independence Day, he unfortunately finally acted. In a matter of seconds, Robert Crimo shattered multiple families, ended several lives, and scarred a community forever. And as the nation began to ask the grand question, why, all of those who formerly knew him were now wondering how nobody saw it coming. Today, we are going to dive into the dark world of Robert Crimo, review the videos that he left behind, and finally take a look at the strange artifacts and notes, and even search for a motive. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. Welcome to the first video in our new studio, and welcome to 2026. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at the case of Robert Crimo. Now, I have to be real with you here, it is actually quite rare for a case to get under my skin like this one. We've got red flags, unsettling behavior, and a bizarre trail of internet breadcrumbs that feels more like a twisted puzzle than a story. So, one of the most interesting aspects about this killer is that there seems to be many masks behind his personality. For example, you've got the quiet boy, the troubled teen, the edgy rapper, and the online troll. But behind each of these faces lies an even darker undercurrent. With that said, folks, I think you're going to need a strong coffee for this story. And so with that said, please grab yourself a brew, get comfortable, and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Robert Crimo. Welcome to Highland Park, folks. Just a short ride north of Chicago and found right beside the waters of Lake Michigan. It's a charming town that is found in a beautiful part of America. Quiet leafy streets meander between rows of heritage brick homes. And here, coffee shops do seem to be a dime a dozen. Perfect for all those cold mornings over winter. And when summertime hits, well, you're met with beautiful scenery. And I truly mean that, because when the sun is out, Illinois is absolutely breathtaking. As for Highland Park itself, it isn't merely just an important part of Chicago's North Shore, but is a place where the 4th of July is a special tradition that is stitched into the town's identity. Independence Day is a huge thing here, and you will see that every year, its Central Avenue will burst into life with red, white, and blue. You get to experience the full shebang here, with marching bands, cotton candy, and neighbors sharing good food across the street. It's the kind of morning that feels comfortable, familiar, and safe. Now, unfortunately, with COVID happening over 2020 and then 2021, the grand event was sadly cancelled. But by the time that 2022 came around, everybody was ready to restart this great tradition with a boom. And the weather seemed to agree here too, because at one point, the sky was clear without a single cloud in sight. But here's the thing, then this happened.
Terror on the streets of Chicago as a gunman opens fire during a parade.
We begin with the mass shooting at a July 4th parade in a Chicago suburb.
Tragically, all of this happened while Highland Park's parade was in full swing. Not only was a band from the local synagogue playing across the road, but kids were chasing after candy and parents were in the middle of dinner on lawn chairs. And that is when the sound of several distinct gunshots rang out. In fact, you can even see in some recordings that, while some people did realize that something was happening and were now running away, there were other people who were still blissfully ignorant of the danger behind them. But as the gunshots continued, and then people started to fall to the ground, that is when the music fully stopped and screams started to erupt. In a mere matter of moments, panic unfolded across Central Avenue. Families scattered, parents shielded their children, and furniture was overturned while the sound of bullets echoed throughout the streets. And what initially began as a day of happiness and celebration soon turned into one of absolute terror. Yet somehow, just as soon as all of this panic had erupted, it suddenly disappeared. And as for the killer, well, they had vanished too. People soon realized that all of the danger was actually coming from above, because the shooter, well, they'd positioned themselves on the rooftop of one of the local shops, before then silently fleeing away on foot. Witnesses caught only glimpses of the shooter, but what they saw was a frail woman with long dark hair and a very slender frame, which, as you'll soon realize, ouch, that will have definitely hurt the shooter's ego. And as for the gun, which by the way was an AR-15 style rifle, that would soon be found abandoned nearby. The confusion about who the gun belonged to would not last very long either, because after tracing it back to its owner via its serial number, they realized that it belonged to a man named Robert Eugene Crimo III, a 21-year-old man who actually lived nearby in Highland Park. And so, alongside this surveillance image, they would then release both his name and description to the public, including a description of his car, which was a 2010 Honda Fit. And so, within minutes, Robert's face was plastered all over America, and people far and wide knew his name and his description. Basically, the authorities described him as slender, had long dark matted hair, and had tattoos all over his neck and face. Now, if you imagine Shaggy if he lost Scooby-Doo, fell into a tattoo studio, and then committed to several years of hard drugs, he would probably look like this. Now, at this stage in the investigation, they actually described Robert as, quote, a person of interest. But to be honest with you, I think the moment they saw this surveillance image, they knew that he was probably the shooter. And so, with that said, the manhunt was officially on. As the hours ticked by, there was still no sign of Robert, and people began to wonder if maybe he had already fled the state. And unfortunately, there were even more disturbing questions like, was he maybe planning to strike again? Now, what the public did not actually know yet was that Robert had in fact actually left Illinois. Not only that, but he was now heading north towards Wisconsin with a second rifle and over 60 rounds of ammunition. We don't actually know why, but thankfully, he would actually cancel these plans along the way. Not only that, but he would also make the most stupid decision available and then headed back towards Illinois. In fact, it was around 6:30 p.m. that afternoon that the authorities clocked his car only 5 miles away from the original crime scene. And so, no surprise, he was arrested right there on the spot. It did seem that, for a brief moment, Robert even tried to flee from the officers. But without anywhere to go, and realizing that he had absolutely no way of escaping them, he surrendered without a fight only a few seconds later. Both dashcam and phone footage later showed him stepping out of his car slowly, dressed all in black. He then lay flat on the pavement with his arms outstretched before then being arrested. And just like that, the manhunt was thankfully over. But of course, in many ways, this was only just the beginning. Because as the name Robert Crimo spread, people slowly began to find out who he was online. And the more that they uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not just some quiet loner, but a man who already had quite a large presence online. And so, on that note, who precisely was Robert Crimo? And what could have possibly driven him to do something so horribly inhumane? The thing is, when he was questioned by detectives, Robert confessed almost immediately. He didn't try to run from who he was or what he had done, and simply accepted it as if it was just another day in Highland Park. And when they began to take a look online at who he was, what they uncovered was even more disturbing, because they soon realized that this was not just a case of someone snapping out of the blue, but something that was both far deeper and far darker. The truth is that Robert had been displaying multiple red flags for several years by now, and the warning signs, well, they were things that no one seemed to act on until, unfortunately, it was far too late. But before we get into all of the hows and whats, let's first take a look at Robert's younger years, because as you will soon realize, that leaves behind a clue or two. So, starting from the very beginning, the name was Robert Bobby E. Crimo III. What a bloody mouthful, let me tell you that. It turns out that he grew up only a few minutes away from the streets that he would later terrorize. Born in the year 2000, he was the middle child in a fractured household, and one that, unfortunately, was filled with many problems. Now, on paper, the Crimos looked like any other ordinary family. His father was the proud owner of a deli, and he would even once run for mayor. On the side, his mother would also dabble in alternative healing and in therapy. However, behind closed doors, things were very far from normal. When Bobby was only 2 years old, the police responded to a disturbing phone call that was made from a concerned stranger. A random passerby had noticed that Bobby was left inside a hot car for nearly half an hour, all while his own mother went swanning off to go shopping. As a result, she was arrested for child endangerment, and would even plead guilty to her own foolish decisions. Not that this changed anything though, because the family home would remain turbulent. Over the next several years, the police were called to the property more than 10 times, with neighbors recalling explosive arguments and shouting between Robert's parents. Many people would also report that there were many arguments that happened between them publicly in the family-run deli. So, stepping back for a moment here, it is quite easy to see that Robert did not have a comfortable upbringing, and unfortunately, it gets worse. From videos that he posted online, you can see that Bobby kept to himself while at school. He always appeared to be quiet, withdrawn, and never seemed to smile in any of his photos. But what he did find comfort in was skateboarding and video games, and you can see through many of the videos that he's posted that he would spend many hours at the local skate park with his only real friend Anthony Laporte. He would also play a lot of Call of Duty Zombies, which was the main theme that often came up in many of his real-life videos later on. As for the real world, like I said, he would spend a lot of time with his friend Anthony at the skate park. The two called themselves the Handsome Crew and would often film themselves around parks. It looks like Robert made many of these videos in retrospect and used nostalgic music to remember the good times. And unfortunately, there is good reason for this too, because sadly, in 2017, Anthony tragically died of an overdose. It is obvious to see that the loss of his best friend ruined Robert. He stopped going out, stopped showing up to his classes, and eventually would even drop out of school. And with his friend now gone and his family broken, he spent all of his time in his room on the internet. It is while here and alone that he began to build something different and eventually something darker. A persona that he liked to call Awakened, before then eventually rebranding to Awake the Rapper. Now, at this point in his life, he had already uploaded many tracks online ever since the age of 11. However, it was around 2017 that things really did begin to take shape. By 18, he had now become Awake the Rapper, an aspiring hip-hop artist with face tattoos, a nihilistic persona, and a growing obsession with violence. Under the new name, Robert or Awake flooded the internet with songs, videos, blog posts, his own website, and even merchandise. He scattered his new content all across multiple platforms, most of which was filled with disturbing images of mass shootings, death, and self-destruction. And over time, this rhetoric grew darker. In one video named Toy Soldier, Bobby used stick figure animation to depict a man and a woman, before then panning to a man dressed like him as a shooter. He then opened fire on a crowd, before then being shot and killed by cops. And another video, which was titled Are You Awake?, was even more disturbing to watch. In this video, he spoke in a rather robotic voice, delivering what almost sounded like his final words. Rather than quote him here, I'm just gonna let you listen to him instead.
Like a sleepwalker, I am breaking through no matter what. Like a sleepwalker, unable to stop and think. My actions will be valiant, and my thought is unnecessary. I know what I have to do. I know what's in it, not only for me, but for everyone else. Where am I going? I don't know, I don't care. There is no past or future, just the now. It is more abstract than I could ever imagine. I can feel the atmosphere pushing me in. It's unstoppable, like a wave pulling me under. I can't breathe without it. I can't see or hear what I don't want. I need to leave now.
After watching most of his videos, it is quite clear to see that Robert had some sort of fixation with July the 4th. Throughout many of his drawings, he would repeatedly post the number 47, an inversion of 7-4, of course that being Independence Day. I mean, in hindsight, when you look at it that way, it kind of looks like a countdown. His social media was just as disturbing too. He designed his own personal logo, which of course looks eerily similar to another well-known hate symbol. And not only would he share violent memes online, but he would also name his Discord server SS, that being a direct nod to Hitler's paramilitary unit. However, politically speaking, Robert was actually quite contradictory in his methodology, and although he attended at least 2 pro-Trump rallies in 2020 and even dressed as Where's Waldo at one, he would also post about multiple government conspiracies online and was quite nihilistic about everything. So he didn't really seem to follow any clear ideology, but did seem to chase clout and notoriety. Basically, Robert was cooked on the inside with dark and edgy internet subculture, and from the year 2019 onward, the warning signs would only grow louder. Somehow, no one thought to stop him. And I'm quite surprised by that, because in hindsight, some of his videos were extremely worrying. Like this one, for example.
Have you been held a prisoner of your own device? Freedom. 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 Freedom? Freedom. Free. Dumb. Freedom. Buy it now. Freedom. Are you in need of freedom? Are you in need of freedom? Are you in need of freedom? Well, buy it today. Have you been held a prisoner of your own device?
Now, in fairness, I don't think that you'd immediately feel killer vibes after watching that, but at the very least, you'd probably think that he was some cringeworthy creep. But, unfortunately, it gets even worse. It was in April of 2019 that Robert apparently tried to end his life with a machete, and although we don't know how close he came, officers reportedly found him withdrawn yet cooperative. Which to me, if you read between the lines, sounds like he hadn't actually hurt himself yet, he was merely just flaunting it. Now apparently, at the time, Robert told officers that he was already receiving mental health treatment, and so no further action was taken. However, what we now know in hindsight is that Robert was actually receiving no support whatsoever. This was all just a lie. And then, only 4 months later, police received yet another phone call from a very concerned family member. And that's because apparently Robert was threatening to kill everybody in the household, and when police searched his bedroom, they found 16 knives, a dagger, and a samurai sword. Now, Robert denied any wrongdoing whatsoever, but just to be on the safe side, officers would cautiously file a report anyway, labeling him as a clear threat to both himself and others. But the thing is, this still did nothing, because when the police then reviewed the file a few weeks later, they dismissed it anyway. And so, only a couple days after that, all of the charges were dropped and the weapons were returned to Robert's father. Only 3 months later, and in January of 2020, Robert applied for a firearm owner's ID card. And although he was underage at the time and needed a sponsor, and despite everything that had happened prior, his father foolishly decided to sign that form. He would later claim that Robert's issues were merely just a teenage outburst, and that since he had no criminal record at the time, he shouldn't be determined as a bad person. To make things even worse, the state would even approve the application without any further review needed, meaning that it wasn't only his father that failed him, but the system too. Over the next 2 years between 2020 and 2022, Robert then legally purchased 5 firearms, including pistols, a shotgun, and an M&P 15 rifle. As you can see, there were no consequences to his previous outbursts. Well, actually, there was one small consequence. After being kicked out of his family home, he ended up living with his uncle Paul in a small apartment in Highwood. However, in a way, that actually kind of made everything so much worse. And that's because Robert would grow even more isolated. He kept to himself, was unemployed, spent most of his time online, grieved the death of his best friend, and now had fully dropped out of college and was no longer seeing his family. And add 5 firearms to the mix, and, well, it takes no smart cookie to feel at least a little bit concerned here. Not only that, but in the background, the Crimo family was falling apart too. I mean, for one, the deli, which used to be a neighborhood anchor, had now shut its doors due to spiraling debt. It turns out that his father owed more than $1.6 million in debt, and the family home was set to go up for sale after being mortgaged far beyond its value. The business was now falling apart, and despite the distance between Robert and his family, he would have seen this all happening behind closed doors. And with all that financial pressure, tension, and quiet collapse happening around him, that chaos easily grew into resentment. Online, his fantasies were turning even darker, and in one of his videos, he rapped, "You're all sinners, you're all going to die." He would also film himself driving past a local synagogue while muttering rather disturbing things. And in an act that shows that he was planning this massacre, he would even record himself in Central nearly a year before his actions. By June of 2022, Robert had chosen his date of July the 4th. He began to scout rooftops, select pathways, and even prepare a disguise. And then, as we know, this happened.
Gunman opens fire during a parade, killing at least 6 people.
The shooting was very rapid and seemed to be a lot of it.
It's just horrible to see all that terror.
In the early morning hours of July the 4th, Robert dressed in women's clothing, including a wig, makeup, and long sleeves to hide his tattoos. He then walked towards downtown with his rifle wrapped inside a blanket, climbed a fire escape, set himself up on the rooftop of an outdoor outfitter, and from there, established a clear line of sight over Central Avenue. At 10:14 a.m., and as marching bands passed beneath him, Robert opened fire. We've already covered what happened next, but in the space of mere minutes, over 70 rounds were fired, each shot aimed into a crowd with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. In total, 7 people were murdered that day. Kevin and Irina McCarthy were both shot while shielding their toddler son. Catherine Goldstein was murdered while standing next to her daughter, and Stephen Strauss, who was 88 years old, was there out of tradition. Meanwhile, Nicholas Toledo, who was 78 years old, was hesitant to leave his home, but after being convinced by his family to go get some fresh air, he decided to go to the parade. And Jackie Sondheim was a beloved local preschool teacher who was merely out to support her community. When he began to hear sirens, Robert then dropped the rifle and descended the ladder going back towards ground level. And while in disguise, he then slipped into the crowd and kept his head down. To everyone around him, Robert looked like any other terrified citizen. He then walked to his mother's house, grabbed the keys to her Honda Fit, and had even told her that there had been a shooting. She didn't really care though, so she let him go. By the time investigators found the rifle and then traced it back to Robert, he was already out of town. But of course, he was then found only a few hours later, merely minutes away from the crime scene. And this was the moment that the world was, for a lack of a better word, awakened to find out who Robert Crimo really was. All of the dots were suddenly connected all at once, and those online who noticed his strange and dark demeanor over the years realized that this was, in fact, actually no facade. Meanwhile, all of those in the real world suddenly realized that this horrific shooter had a lot of media online which actually screamed red flags. It's kind of like both halves never really had the full picture, but now, well, it's kind of sickening. Outside of his momentarily feeble attempt to run away, Robert didn't ever really resist when he was arrested. He didn't cry or even try to talk his way out of it either. Instead, when finally in custody, he openly spoke about the shooting, and even told investigators that he had considered a second attack in Wisconsin later that day. It was quite obvious that he felt no remorse either, and after looking at all of his social media, it's clear to see that he had fantasized about this for several years. In the days that followed, Highland Park grieved over their enormous loss. It is, in fact, only the tip of the iceberg, because in addition to that, dozens of people were injured, hundreds were mentally scarred, and thousands upon thousands of people who will visit Central Avenue in Highland Park will feel it. Something like this will always completely transform a town. Moving into the legal proceedings of this case, the prosecution did not go slow with Robert. He was initially charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, which was then upgraded to 7 when one of his other victims died in hospital. However, that would only be the beginning. Only a few days later, a grand jury would return with a 117-count indictment, which included 21 counts of murder, 48 counts of attempted murder, and 48 counts of aggravated battery, which actually is quite impressive. I'm still amazed that states like Illinois can slap on so many charges. Of course, these charges reflected the true gravity of Robert's actions, because this wasn't only about 7 people who were murdered, but dozens of others injured, thousands mentally scarred, and an entire community ripped apart. Robert appeared in court on July the 6th. He showed no emotion when his bond was denied, which isn't surprising because, being real, nobody even half expected he would be given such a thing. He also showed no reaction to the victims' families in the courtroom, and no recognition of the lives that he'd ruined in the process. As the case dragged through 2023 and then into 2024, Robert's defense team would try to push for an insanity plea. Meanwhile, the public's anger would turn towards the many red flags that were missed along the way. As a result, the state launched a review into its failed red flag laws, and many civil suits would follow, targeting not only Robert, but the store that had sold him the gun and his very own father who signed his license. In fact, in a rather unusual but welcomed move, Bobby's father, Robert Crimo Jr., was also charged with reckless conduct for helping his son obtain a firearm license. He ultimately took a plea deal over a misdemeanor charge, which landed him 60 days in jail. And despite that tiny sentence, he would only serve half of it before then being released. I can see why many people saw this as a slap on the wrist, and personally, I have to agree. But hey, at least it was something against his father. And then, in a strange twist that nobody saw coming, Robert himself even offered to plead guilty. Now, to begin with, he would actually back out of this initial offer, which would reopen old wounds for survivors who now had to prepare to relive their trauma in court. But several months later, he would then change his mind yet again, and on March the 3rd, 2025, Robert Crimo III formally pled guilty to 21 counts of murder and 48 counts of attempted murder. At the time of his plea, he was 24 years old, and of course, he was going to receive the harshest sentence possible in Illinois. It was on April the 24th of 2025 that he was officially sentenced. The judge, Victoria Rossetti, would hand down the only sentence that made sense. For all of his actions, he received 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. And if that wasn't enough already, he was given 50 more years for each attempted murder. Now, the angering thing about all of this is that Robert didn't even attend any of his sentencing. That means that he didn't see or face any of the people whose lives that he'd shattered, and he wouldn't even have to listen to any of the impact statements. Instead, his chair remained empty while people just merely spoke to that space instead. For 2 days, survivors and grieving families would deliver those impact statements. Words were spoken into a space where Robert should have been, and I think for a spineless man like him, he should have been forced against his will to listen to all of these statements. To be honest with you, I can't believe that he was actually allowed to opt out of it. I think that sounds ridiculous. So, by now, we've walked through most of Robert's story, but of course there is still one big question that still remains here, and that is, why did he do it? Robert was a quiet, awkward and shy kid from an otherwise peaceful town, and although sure, his childhood wasn't the best in some areas, it wasn't too bad either. So, what transformed him into a horrible killer? The truth is, we don't actually know, because although there is a lot of media that he shared online, he never really gave a direct motive, or a manifesto. I mean, he did create this rather strange cryptic letter, which we'll get to in just a moment, and there is that strange Are You Awake video too, with all of those strange lyrics, but as for a direct manifesto, no, not really. Even after the fact and in police interviews, he never offered any clear explanation either. All we really have are these strange videos, violent lyrics, and digital breadcrumbs that, yeah, do suggest and hint towards something, but never provide any clear, concrete answer. And so, in the absence of a confession, we are left without any hard facts. All we can really do is retrace the outlines of his life and speculate. Mental health struggles almost certainly played a role here, and Robert's downward spiral followed an all too common pattern of social withdrawal, suicidal ideation, and violent fantasies. It all seemed to begin with the death of his closest friend. He shut down emotionally, and while there were police visits and fleeting contact with mental health services, nothing stuck. Robert had no treatment plan, no consistent follow-through, and no actual support. Meanwhile, his mother posted online about spiritual healing, but not actual therapy, and whatever help he may have needed, it never seemed to materialize. In addition to this is the element of loneliness too. He lost the one close friend he had, dropped out of school, never seemed to recover, never formed any lasting bonds, never had a proper relationship, and then moved away from his family. Instead, he seemed to find a home in online echo chambers, where edginess and weird behavior is totally normalized, and people seem to lean into violence, which is often rewarded with attention. And as I've already mentioned, he seemed to have only aesthetic ideological influences. Because although he did dabble in far-right imagery, posted hate symbols, and even admired killers like Lee Harvey Oswald, it wasn't clean-cut extremism either. He didn't target anyone based on race or religion, and never seemed to talk about it either. In short, it was all just kind of random. I think the main thing that sticks with me here is that, more than anything, he seemed to be obsessed with the idea of becoming someone rather than fighting for any sort of cause. He animated his own school shooter fantasies, rapped about his own death, and even edited himself into a sniper's perspective over Central Avenue. Add a whole bunch of emo montages to the mix and, well, I've got one word for you: narcissism. So, what really was Robert's motive? Although we can never really tell, what I would put it down to is poor mental health, and Robert desperately trying to make a name for himself no matter the cost. All that we really do know is that he documented himself for multiple years before the attack, and that none of this actually seemed to be spontaneous. And so, on that note, could all of this have possibly been stopped? Well, unfortunately, the answer is yes, because those warning signs were always there. The threats, the police reports, and the violent videos online were obvious red flags, and in the end, the system looked the other way in every opportunity. All of the questions surrounding his motive have not disappeared either. In the aftermath of this attack, Illinois tightened its laws, hoping that this will deter shooters in the future. Although, unfortunately, many national loopholes remain. There is no full answer to why this happened, and unfortunately, we likely will never know. But speaking of never knowing, Robert did release a 28-page document called Arcturus. It's a long sequence of numbers that still to this day have not been deciphered. But of course, this might be his own cryptic way of releasing a personal manifesto. By the way, while researching this one, I realized that my good friend Diatrip covered this case a little over a year ago, and it seems that after sharing Arcturus with his followers, one of them actually managed to crack page 1. I'll be leaving a screenshot of it right here for you to read. Oh, and just another shout out to Diatrip here. If you'd like another in-depth perspective of this case, then please do check him out. The guy works so hard on his videos and deserves the recognition. Just one more random side note, by the way, but Robert Crimo's old family home is actually abandoned now too. Another YouTuber who goes by the name of Stringer Media decided to look in the family home and speak to a few locals. Here are a few clips of the house in its current state, and if you'd like to see more of this, I advise you check out his own channel too. Anyway folks, I think I've covered all of the important parts today, so I'm going to wrap this one up here. But I'll finish by saying that this case leaves behind an entire graveyard of what-ifs. The truth is, we may never actually know Robert's motives. All we're really left with are a whole bunch of red flags and a troubled mind that caused a lot of pain for, well, nothing really. Now, to be honest with you, I don't like giving killers a platform unless it's at their own expense, and so I'd like to remind you that Robert Crimo is a very poor excuse of a human. And for whatever bravado that he thinks he might have, just remember that he is nothing but a cringeworthy narcissist who thinks that disgust equals attention. And I hope you're enjoying prison, emo Shaggy. Anyway folks, that really is it for me today. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you again very shortly for another video. If you found this case interesting, then please do remember to subscribe, it really does help the channel out. Otherwise, if you want to follow me on social media, just go to Coffeehouse Crime on Facebook or Instagram, and yeah, I think that's pretty much it today. Until I see you again, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay safe and stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.